So it's really wonderful to have this conversation with you today, Buster. Thank you very much for being willing to have it with me.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to chat with you. And I know we talked a couple times, but never um, enough, I think. So I'm excited to dive into something with you.
Yeah, me too. Um, okay, well, we should probably begin with
Let's do it.
we should probably begin with the coronavirus.
Yes.
So you're living in the Bay Area. How has it been for you and your family so far, particularly in the last
Pretty.
2 weeks?
Yeah, it's really hard to even just have a personal experience of it, I think, since it's happening to everybody sort of at the same time. And um, I was part of some communities that were very early sort of warning systems around this, and were freaking out, a month or two ago.
Mhm.
And so I feel like I'm adjusted. I've sort of acclimated to this new, like, we don't leave the house today. We go on hikes. So we've gone on a hike today, the
Yeah.
whole family, and a bike ride we did a couple days ago. We're homeschooling. I have two kids, 9 and 3.
Hmm.
My job is, on my own, so I can work from home. I mean, not that I've done any of that, the last week, but I could
You could
potentially, in
you could
theory, work from
hypothetically,
home.
yes. Yeah.
Exactly. And a lot of my time is really just about like having conversations with people and helping them on board to this new reality where, like, there's sort of like this flip where, like, it just feels completely alien
Hmm.
for a while, and then at some point it flips to like, oh, this is normal, and the way we used to live is sort of alien.
Right.
Like, and I think I've made that flip, but it's a bumpy landing, I think, for lots of people. And yeah.
I also have a friend living in Southern California who was very kind enough to onboard me, as you say, some months back. And I didn't know much about the coronavirus at that point. And we were having these conversations on a once monthly basis to talk about spirituality and things of that sort. And in this particular case, he said, "Well, let me tell you a bit more about the coronavirus." And I thought, "What?" Or I've heard about it, but and
Yeah.
he's then going through tears of preparation, which I'm scribbling down on a piece of paper. And they were very sage. And in fact, what he was suggesting then, in light of the research he had done, and in light of the what he tuned into, turned out so far to be pretty prescient and correct. So that was a very helpful adaptive process, and as you say too, an acclimatizing process. I can also say something that's really quite perhaps unique about my situation with my wife. I live with my wife in northern New Mexico. Is that since living in New York City in 2012 or so, we've been living in pretty close, you might even say, home quarantine settings for
Mm.
the last 6 or 7 years. Not so right now that we have a house here, but we've been living around each other 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for about 7 years. And so, what really worries me from a very simple meditative or even psychological point of view is that this is probably the first time in quite some time that that loved ones and people who care for one another will be living in close quarters for possibly, we don't know yet, but maybe even 2 months at a time. Uh,
Mhm.
I'm 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 a bit concerned about how that's going to wear on people, and about how nerves are going to fray. People are looking at
Yeah.
what the macro situation, and we can probably get into that if we feel so inclined. But the micro situation, the intimacy,
Mm.
is also a curious one.
Yeah. Yeah. And interesting because I was on a walk with my wife yesterday, and we're like, what if we have to be doing this for 18 months? What if this is like our new life? I was like, isn't that the life that we like? Isn't that the best life? Like, to spend time with the people that you love, and get to like be there for each other 24/7. I mean, it was a spin on it because it could either destroy us. I mean, there's oftentimes
Mhm.
a fear of closeness and forced, time together that makes you think that maybe we were creating that buffer as a survival mechanism.
Mhm.
But also, like, maybe it makes us stronger. Maybe it makes us, more connected. Maybe it brings, and then I have seen way more evidence of this in the last 2 weeks than of the other thing, right? Which is
Mhm.
people, you know, hosting, happy hour on Zoom, or, sharing, doing, using Marco Polo or all these other sort of video chat situations to like share their inner, like, not the like how to be more productive, how to get, that promotion or whatever, but it's like, here's some recipes, here's like a cool game to play with each other, here's a way to, spend time together in a pleasant way. It's like a total switch that it reminds me of the early web in a lot of ways. Like that's what we're talking about in the early web, was just like the silly stuff. And now we're sort of bringing it back out of a need for survival, but also a need to like collectively improve each other's morale and support
Yeah,
each other.
right. I hope that's the case. I've begun to see a lot more tenderness and care and concern. Uh, I mean, people are writing to me in different ways that hadn't written to me a while, or asking questions. And the question, "How are you?" is a much sweeter question now than it was before.
Yeah, and there's so much more variance in the answer now. Like
Mm,
it's
mm,
depending on your situation, it could be dire or it could be okay.
right.
Um, and you could be just figuring things out, or you could be like one up on everything and you're like ready to like help people. So like asking that question is now a really a high information question to ask,
Yeah.
especially people that I'm like reaching out to my family friends, but also my
Mm,
single friends and people that are in like more dire situations, and like for them it's like they have to be in their own apartment by themselves, and that's
yeah.
a whole different experience and a whole different set of problems
Mm.
than what I have, which is no time to myself. So
You were telling me before we hit record that you have two young children upstairs somewhere, and
yeah,
so
you might hear them pounding on the floor.
yeah, yeah. If not, I'll simulate it here.
Yes. Sounds like a large Saint Bernard dog, but he's really only like 3 years old.
So one of the things that I've really appreciated about our correspondences to date is that you seem to really love conversations. So this is obviously a meta question, but what is it that you love about conversations?
Yeah, man, I think I subscribe to the conversational nature of reality sort of philosophy that David White coined. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it's an interesting way of framing our relationship to the world, our relationship to each other, our relationship to ourselves. All of these things are dialogues.
Mm,
Um, and that means a dialogue is you interacting with something that's not you, in some sense, or like something that's unknown to you, unfamiliar, perhaps dissonant, perhaps difficult, perhaps unwelcome,
mm,
sometimes very welcome, sometimes very insightful and resonant. But either way, it's the frontier where you can sharpen yourself in
mm,
some way, um, and then in the sense of like I might learn something, I might connect with somebody, I might enjoy this conversation. There might be something surprising and interesting. Um, we might reach a new level of insight that neither of us had before. All these things that you can't do if you're. I mean, perhaps you can if you're like in deep meditation for long periods of time. You can tell me this does happen, in retreats and stuff, but it also happens in conversations, and conversations are the meta skill that underpin all of our other skills in a lot of ways. Like this is
mm.
how we transfer information. This is how we receive information. This is how we learn. This is how we understand. This is how we grow wise. This is how we feel connected. This is how we talk to ourselves. All of this is conversation,
Mm.
and we've
Can
got
you unpack that a little bit more? Maybe you're in the midst of doing so. How is this
yeah,
the meta skill that underlies all of our other skills?
yeah. Because how else will you partner with somebody? How else will you um, learn from the work of somebody else? How else will you um, bring people together and inspire them? How else will you um, learn a new craft? How else will you really do anything other than through dialogue of some sort? Some of it might be through reading, some of it might be through watching, but they're all at one point or another conversational skills. Like they're, one person speaking, we have a whole mess of, thoughts in our heads and feelings, and then we turn it into words and sounds, and that's our road to connecting with somebody else. And by thinking about the skills about how we do that, like whether it's, oh, I'm in a conversation, and sort of like playing ping pong or something,
Right.
but you're always just focusing on just like batting the ball back over there.
Right.
You're not thinking about your defense. You're not thinking about improving your skills. You can have a completely different experience if
Mm,
you're seeing the conversation as a skill building process, as going to the gym,
mm,
as practicing something that's more than just the content of the conversation, but the style and the art of it. And those skills, which are just called conversational habits, are, we inherit them, and we just have not really focused on making them better. We don't think about, how do I get better at
mm,
um, um, in the midst of a conversation, integrating cognitive dissonance or anxiety, and finding the value behind it and reflecting it back and asking about it.
mm.
There's not a class for this. There's no PhDs in this. There's no experts, and so we just wing it. And whatever, if nothing works, then we're just like, screw it, I'm done. I can't talk to you. I
Sure.
don't like you because I can't talk to you. And
Ah,
then polarization happens, and all these other
mm,
things happen.
mhm. I found over the years that uh, during which I've been philosophizing that it's so interesting to be talking with all sorts of people around the world. And in my case, it's really quite curious because I set it up such that I don't know too much about the other person, as is really true in this conversation, actually. And I can't see the other person's face. There's only so much information I'm getting through, and largely through the ear. Uh, so it puts it into this kind of performance space
Hmm.
in which I usually can't see, the other person can't see. We can only hear each other. We don't know how long we'll be speaking. And what's so fascinating, this is what I'm trying to get around to, is that people's idioms are different, their linguistic skills are different, their manner of speaking, to be sure, is different. Uh, the range of cares and concerns is different, and I'm not really doing a service to the degree of variation here.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something that happens, and I'm sure it'll happen in this conversation if we want to be met all of a sudden, in which we're starting to get a hang for how we speak to one another as it unfolds. We're getting, I like to think of it a little bit like both of us catching a tune.
Hmm.
Before we didn't quite hear it, or we sort of were trying it out, but we start to, if all's going well, then we kind of catch the tune together, and then it starts to move in certain directions. That's
Yeah.
that's one thing I love about it, and you're right. It is a bit like confronting the alien, and so to speak, and welcoming the alien or other.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I like that a lot. And it's that, whether it's called optimal grip, or like,
Mm,
getting in sync, or sort of getting on the same page, or whatever it is that like happens when you have a shared language. Suddenly you're like, oh, suddenly I know that you know what I'm saying, and you know that I know what you're saying, and now we can just explore or whatever. Um, that point is the point at which disagreements, I think, can start to happen.
mm,
Up until that point, and this is sort of what I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, is like, we try to do it way earlier than that. We try to do it at the door, right? We're like, I
try to
don't
do
like
what?
you.
Try to do what?
We try to disagree with someone, or tell
Oh,
them
okay.
something that they don't want to hear, or
I see.
um, all these things that you know that a good chunk of many people's lives are about, like, disagreeing. Sort of, you're listening for the things you disagree with so you can
Mm,
refute them. um, and we think that we can play this game of, let's win this, let's solve this disagreement, before you've reached that point of goodwill, or
mm,
whatever that catching the tune is. I really like that. Or like, some people call it like the dance, or all these other things that's like
mm,
about, like, more than just talking to each other.
mm,
But really hard to, it's easy to fake also. And
mm, mm.
um, so there's all these problems with it. But it's one of the things that I've been talking about with people around disagreement, since that's what I've been thinking about a lot, is focus first on getting to that point of, like, getting on the same page.
You
And
establish
we
kind of conviviality, as Ivan Illich would put it.
and the funny thing, and
Establish the conviviality without any kind of agenda with respect to needing to or wanting to have a disagreement. The disagreement arises if it arises. You should
right,
want to love that person, if I might put it a little bit poetically.
Absolutely. And that's the twist, I think, is once you're there, you don't have a disagreement anymore. Oftentimes it's like, yeah, do what you want to do. I trust you.
Right. Yeah.
But, you have to it still looks like that when you're approaching that point in a conversation. There's plenty of people that you can imagine in your head that are evil people that have terrible beliefs that are hurting people. And you can't imagine ever reaching a point where like, oh, I trust you. Go and do what you think is right.
Yeah.
So
I wonder, are there certain things that you'd really like to talk about? I was just thinking about moving from establishing the fact that here we are in the midst of uncanny times. As Yeats said, things are falling apart, the center cannot hold. Or we can quote, if we want to, the Chinese apocryphal blessing or curse, may you live in interesting times. We can cite line and verse, or we can quote Hamlet, things are out of joint. But whatever it is that we quote, we do feel that. And the reason I wanted to start this conversation with talking about the nature of conversation is that I think you and I both share the belief and feeling that conversations are perhaps at the center of what could help us move forward during these uncanny times. But I'm also, in light of the fact that we're beginning at a rather meta level, aware of the fact that there are certain things that you may wish to talk about. So that's where my question comes from.
no, I think that's been my mission for the last few years is, I remember asking myself like, what is my contribution going to be useful for? How can I participate in a way that like makes things, it's a positive contribution rather than a negative one.
Right.
And it took me a while because many of the first things that come to mind just don't really resonate with me very much personally. Like I'm not a great activist or evangelist, or I can't just, you know, there's a lot of things that I'm just not the best at. But finding the weird side path is sort of my interest, and
Yeah.
conversation. So I just sort of stumbled on it because I was interested in cognitive bias, because that was this intro to motivated reasoning and like why do I think I'm right, and why do I think I'm being a civil disagreeer and everything is falling apart, and just asking like, clearly one of these things that I hold dear aren't really that valuable. um, and that led me down this crazy path.
We hold these biases to be self-evident that all human beings have them.
Yeah, yeah, and we think that we can get out of it somehow, and that we can, help others get out of it, but it's a lot harder than that. So yeah, I think that the conversation is the heart of it. I think that it's the skill that we were never taught, unlike reading and writing and these other skills that are like all these crafts. There is no craft of conversation that's like held up high in our society. If it ever was, it's held in like formal debate, or it's held in sort of persuasion, or it's held up in logic and rationality, but it's not in everyday relating conversation um, that most of us, 99% of us, are swimming in all day.
Right, and the examples you just proposed, whether it's oratory or rhetoric or logic or certain kind of heuristics or debate, all these have very pointy targets, many of which involve defeating your opponent, right? So they're martial in nature, and I think we're hinting at something that's friendlier, exploratory. In my philosophical conversations, what's really interesting is that they're rather disarming. That is, I'm beginning with someone whom I'm taking to have a certain kind of inchoate or implicit knowledge. And it's simply my responsibility to ask the kinds of questions that are allowing this person to unfold a truth. And then what's really remarkable to me, or what I've discovered over the years, is that two things seem to converge at one and the same time. The first is that we understand one another, particularly as we arrive at certain points in the conversation. And the second is that we understand something. It's that convergence between understanding one another at the same time that we understand the thing at hand that is so fecund. Right, we usually have conversations in which Martin Buber talks about the I-it. That is, we're trying to understand something, if I may put that a little bit too quickly. And we have other conversations in which we're, say, that are interpersonal in nature, and we have a conflict of some kind or squabble, and we're unfortunately just trying to resolve it or unwind it. So it's more of an I thou. But what happens when you converge on the truth at hand? You might not put it that way, but let's say that you converge on the matter at hand and you understand something fundamental about it. At the same time that you converge on, or meet, as people will say sometimes, you meet one another. That's the beauty of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think of it as like stereo vision, right? Like there's like, you got one eye, or you're walking around and thinking about the it and the them. And then when you can connect with another person and look at a thing, you could now see that thing in 3 dimensions, right? Or
Yes.
whatever the social version of that is. It's like, oh, I understand it in a more richly, like, it's not just about my perspective, it's about multiple perspectives of the thing. And
Certainly.
It's an aha moment in a lot of ways, because like you couldn't have seen that other side without them, and they couldn't have done the same without you. Yeah, and it's, but that's not how we don't have those metaphors in our in our back pocket for at least I'm not aware of them, as far as like, hey, let's go into this, this meeting, this board meeting, and let's try to like get a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional understanding of our finances or whatever. We're just like, I'm here to present something, you're here to like shoot it down, and we'll hopefully come out with it.
I think what could be an interesting turn in our conversation would be toward a paper that you wrote for the Medium. And there are just a few things from there that I found really quite interesting, namely the fact that you actually are quite concerned with the sacred, even if you are not religious in nature. So that might be a point where we turn toward existential openings in the sacred. But maybe to get there, I liked what you said before about finding the weird path. So can you tell us a bit more about the weird path?
Yeah, I think I've just had this sense. It's sort of been my my go-to trick for life, is that whatever it takes to optimizing something, there's always a playbook, right? And I think that because there's a playbook, the expectations become predictable. I mean, the outcomes become predictable, and those outcomes become sort of dampened because you're sort of just doing the same thing that has been done before. And I've always felt like there's always, that's a way to a local maxima in a lot of ways. But there's a weird path that seems like you're winding around the mountain or something, but suddenly gets you to a much higher peak on that understanding. But it's going to suck, right? It's going to feel like you're lost 90% of the time.
I see.
And so for me,
because you don't have a playbook or a handbook.
You don't have a playbook or a handbook. No one's reassuring you that it's going to work out. You can't reassure yourself because this is new. Like, people are going to tell you you're dumb because you're not going the right way. All these things, and maybe you are. That's the part with the other part that's been really sort of embedded in me is like just a constant self-doubt. There's never, and it's a comforting sort of constant self-doubt in a lot of ways. It's just like, oh yeah, I could be wrong because anyone can be wrong, and we're all wrong about almost everything. So it just prevents me from ever thinking that, oh, I figured it out. It's more like, oh, I figured it out for now, or this step makes sense. The next step is another whole other question.
Right.
But yeah.
Is there an example or two you have that could help to put flesh in the bones here with regard to the weird path?
I mean, so one of the ways that sort of a weird fact that I often pull up, but maybe it's relevant to this question, is when I was 27 or 28, no, 29. How old was I? I should know this. I was probably like, no, I was actually 30 something. I was 30. I decided
when I was 17.
Yeah. One day I was just tired of being myself. I had recently gotten divorced. I'd recently quit my job. I'd recently sold all my possessions and shaved my head and done all these things. It's like, I guess I gotta shed. Because I saw my life and it looked really boring. And I was like, I gotta just like do a weird wiggle and try to get into a different timeline. I changed my name. So one day I was just like, what if I just change my first, middle, and last name legally for a year as a way to just take a vacation from my identity, so that when I come back to it, it'll feel I can just do it more proactively rather than reactively.
Mm.
And it doesn't make sense why I would do that. It's not a rational thing to do. It's not even an emotionally sound thing to do. I didn't have anything I was running from. It was just, I wrote like why in the court papers, like, why are you changing your name? It's like, whimsy, was my reason. Although it like was extreme, like is like a lot of work to do. But through that, I did like have a firsthand experience of like shedding an identity and reconnecting my identity to the things in a more proactive way, because I was at that point in my 30s, I think. And I had tools to like build my belief system and build my sort of rules for living, and I was trying to like get them all locked into my own sense of self. And the only way I felt like I could do that was by changing my name and forcing everyone to like call me a different name, which varying degrees of like humor and annoyance at that kind of thing. So, but
What was
it was
that?
a weird path.
What was that? Yes. What was that year like?
It was weird, and it definitely
Yeah.
took me off of the like. No one ever, I became an unpredictable person to people. I think I started an art gallery. I quit tech. I started an art gallery in a bar in Seattle, and a membership club that was meant to be like a sort of private community that was in person with art, and every night would have different kinds of events and performances. And I just like burned through all my savings doing this because I didn't know how to run a bar or art gallery. But so I did that. Then I think from there it just continued. Like the people that I met were also weirder and also more interesting to me, and I just sort of, it did shift me over to a different timeline, I think. But I can't necessarily write the book on how to shift your timeline, because I don't know. I don't think that's a thing that can work for and repeat, right? But I can say like, just get weirder, do weirder things. Just anything that you think is a rope that can't be broken, break it and then see what happens. As long as, but the problem is that it does also take the other balancing aspect, which is a sense of safety and not non-resentment or cynicism or jadedness, because it's also just like, it could create trauma, I'm sure, if it's done the wrong way. So if you just abandon everyone and like you just like flip every table and burn every bridge, it's not going to work to make you feel more connected. So that's one. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of smaller ones. Like I'm currently trying to escape like the predictable tech career that I have like been part of for 20 years. But also just, I think if every single conversation, it has this little element of uncertainty or weirdness, or it could be a seed for everything, which is just, what if the thing that this narrative is telling us can be peeled off, and it's not, there's nothing underneath. And what if we could sort of wrap something else around it and do something else? But yeah, that's my long rambling answer. I don't know.
You can come up with any answer you want to here.
Yeah, I know. Right.
What is it that got you interested in the sacred? And it was just hinted at in that article.
Yeah.
I should probably provide a little context. I'll include a link to this article in the show notes on YouTube. But here we have someone who ostensibly is not keen on religion, but ostensibly also thinks that there are limits to the particular materialist scientific paradigm. And I know that it seems like you have quite a strong art background. That isn't quite, art doesn't always, unless you're a high modernist, like T.S. Eliot or Joyce doesn't quite get you around to the transcendent, or call it what you will. High modernists, so I'll back up a little bit. High modernists were very interested in seeing that the collapse of uh, the Judeo-Christian worldview was happening all around them. And for a time, it seemed possible to take art and allow art to lift
Right.
us out of the
Right.
muck of commercialism, the slough of despond, the veil of tears, and so forth. But what was it? What
Right.
is it that's your path that's bringing you to a consideration of something that is now very much, as you know, near and dear to my heart?
Yeah, it's interesting because I haven't quite mapped it all out. But I do think it has to do with conversation because as I was writing this book about productive disagreement, one of the conversations I hosted was about ghosts.
Hmm.
And ghosts is an argument that I often get into in very unproductive disagreements with people about. And so I was like, this is going to be a hard one for me. And therefore we should try to do it. I found that just by framing it as like, let's all like share our personal like interpretation of spirits in the ghost realm, and
Sure.
it sort of went in a lot of different directions. And then I stopped laying my like, are they real or not, sort of pressure on it, and just said like, what is this doing for them? Like, what is this doing for you? What is this belief helping you figure out? What job does it play in your sort of mental space? And
Yeah.
I found a completely different answer, which is that, this is a way to put a doorstop into like the unknown and say like, hey, there may or may not be ghosts, but I'm not going to close that door and say that there aren't, because I just refuse to. And I prefer to live in a universe, at least in my own head, that's full of mystery and has infinite potential for mystery. And then like, oh, okay, so that part makes sense to me. And then I realized that it's a language. So ghosts, spirituality, religion, like if you take off all like the calcified, rusty bits around it, like it's a language to talk about vulnerable parts of ourselves, talk about how we process and grieve and how we connect, um, you know, meaning to our lives and all these things. And it sort of led me down this path where like, okay, this language is way more interesting to me than the one I've been using to describe unknown things, like using statistics and probabilities and sort of the scientific method to say yes, anything is possible, and but not everything is probable.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much drier. It's just not as it doesn't work for me to connect me to the unknown. It just
It
describes it.
lacks
I
poetry, of
it
course.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I also read Sean Carroll's book, The Big Picture, around that same time, which is a great book about sort of his, what he called poetic naturalism. Um, and then I started getting into the tarot and the art, of that, like that sort of the art piece and the history of it and the
Mm-hmm.
symbols. And then, just like letting some of that stuff, I don't know, sit in my head for a while and be like, okay, does this help me? Does this give me new tools, the language for describing my internal experience, for like my subconscious to speak to me, for me to interpret events? Because in light of like this model of biases that I have developed, which is like these are all sort of like apps in our brains, in the cheesy way of like to filter information, to make meaning out of it, and to um, help us leap into action. And myths are the same thing. The sacred is the same thing. Ritual is the same thing. Um, you know, uh, all these things are doing the exact same thing that you know the newsfeed is doing for us, or the television channel, or whatever else is filtering and interpreting things for us. In that sense, it was a level playing field suddenly. Like, and I preferred the aesthetic nature of these over here way more than the ones I had been hanging out with. So just like decided to go off in that direction for a bit.
What was it that you felt was somehow missing or wanting that made you open to this possibility?
I think what it is has been described by like Ken Wilber and a couple others around just like development, right? So the fact that wherever we are in our developmental cycle, we need something to develop further. Whereas I think what I was missing was this idea of an objective, or um, not objective really, but just an abstract truth that we sort of sit outside of. we don't think about how this intervention for a child is going to work. It's not going to work for an adult. This intervention for an adult is going to work, but it's not going to work for a child. And it's going to stop working at some point, at which point you'll need another intervention. These are all just like rungs on the ladder to like climb and develop. And we can't unilaterally say this rung is bad anymore. At least I can't. It's like, it has to have that fit. Like it's a person to intervention or psychotechnology or tool fit. That
so my understanding you correctly that when you're appealing to a developmental model, viewers might not know that certain things can be true or true enough at a particular level of development. So let's say you're at stage X, then there's a certain understanding that you have at stage X, and then we can talk with you in certain ways, but that's not sufficient unto itself, perhaps according to a developmental model. So you might, I guess we'll say, progress to another level or model. And then you have another language for describing your map of the territory. And so it's true enough for you at that level, and so on. So according to these developmental models, you have, and I'm making it a little bit simple as if there's just one, but you would imagine different capacities
what do you mean? Yeah.
Developing over time. I think I understand.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as a society, we tend to look down on the tools that we use to climb, or like to expand our understanding as like, we don't need them anymore, therefore we should get rid of them. And having that, I don't know what the word is, there's probably a word for this, just this capacity to accept contexts that aren't yours to thrive and develop and be functional, because so that everyone has a step to move, and not just, they're not cut off from society or from the concept of humanity or humanness or decency or respectfulness or responsibility or independence, all these things that we will cut people off from if they don't do it right, and then they're trapped down there.
So you're also, that's kind of the shortcoming of developmental models, is they create hierarchies of development. But but apart from that, it sounds as though humility and compassion are part of what you think is very appealing to this approach you're taking. It's not the case that someone who is a traditional religious person is therefore no longer a part of the conversation necessarily, as you might put it. That person's a part of the conversation so long as we're willing to welcome that person in a language that makes sense to him or her. And that's also true of someone who's a scientific materialist, a card-carrying scientific materialist. You can talk with someone that way too. You can then talk with someone who's a little more groovy like me, who's a non-dualist, or who's involved in Zen and such. And okay, well, we have, there's a different way of speaking about experiences that can't be put in the words of traditional religion precisely, or in the words of scientific vocabulary.
Yeah. I think there's something like the sacred, it's so easy to scoff at an altar or a reading, but the reason that, I don't know, I think that the reason that we can scoff at them is because we have this really preferred set of tools that does criticize tools that aren't in that set, right? Like scientific tool set of like, but if you go inside the sacred, the altar or the ritual or the myth, those things are doing things that have nothing that the science can't do either. So, and there's just like this language barrier. Again, I think of it as complete, language mismatch in terms of, this is doing a job that has nothing to do with the repeatability of an experiment. It has to do with, me processing something or participating in something that I can then integrate and then be able to process more in the future. And yeah, I I think I've been able to understand that part, but I had never really experienced it um, until recently. And I think now I've combined the sort of potential theory of it with just like the experience of it, and feel like, oh yeah, it makes
If
sense.
you, if you can speak about it on the YouTube channel, what do you mean by you experienced it recently?
Yeah, so my interest in tarot, and I say this knowing that like many people are gonna um, dock some social capital from me from talking about this, but that's okay. Um, so I found a way to really enjoy it, really appreciate it, which was described. It really came to me when I'm reading. I don't think it's here, but um, this book, and I don't even remember the name of it. Something called like Open Reading or something, Open Tarot, um, where he's like describing how to just do a reading, and basically he's describing how to be a really open listener. It's like everything, and it sort of describes this modal shift of like, I'm here to provide a service for you, to like, I'm here to just like plunge into a mythical mode where everything has meaning. Um, and you're just swimming in it, and you can make any of the connections that you need to make without having external or like usually we have to wait for an event or for something to happen to like use that as a reference point. Now you can just use the death card or the Four of Cups or all these other things as reference points. They might as well have happened to you, that are timely right now,
Mm-hmm.
and you can use that as an excuse, not, or as a hook or an affordance, to begin to get a sense for these, find that grip on those things, where those affordances may not even be in your life at all otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read that chapter, and then I sort of started practicing a little bit and be like, wow, it's not that every single time I draw a tarot card that's like magically like telling the future. It's just like I can find something meaningful. I could use this as an affordance to connect me to my own day,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that tends to work for me, uh, and I enjoy it, and it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not serious. But it's playful. It's silly, but it's also honest. Like I feel that it's important.
What do you
Um,
mean it's honest?
um, it's it's not just one of the main criticisms of these kinds of things is that it's filled with scammers, and liars, and um, charlatans, but there is, and they may exist. I mean, I'm sure they do, but there is another way to participate in this that doesn't require you to become that person. It doesn't require you to suddenly um, think that you can tell the future to people and charge money for it. So, um,
That's
so
a
it's
good.
honest in the sense.
That's
Yeah,
the.
go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's honest in the sense that.
Honest in the sense that I do feel like it's helpful for me, and it could be helpful, but not so far as to say that it must be used. Right? It's not. I'm not trying to turn it into. I'm not trying to be a different person necessarily, or have a different career, but I just like it.
Mhm. Well, I'll just since you said something personal, I'll say something personal, and this is not one-upmanship because this is at all. And just I'll tell you how I came to the sacred.
Yeah.
I was raised Lutheran largely, and then by the time I reached high school, I was, I think, in the LaPlanche camp. He said, of God, I have no need of that hypothesis. I
Mm.
was also in high school. So high school, at a certain level of development, means that at least being atheist or agnostic at this moment in time was the cool thing to do. And I do mean it was the aesthetically correct thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was also the case that it seemed as though petitionary prayer, which is a certain really crude form of prayer, which you ask God for something and in a certain spirit, and then God hopefully provide, revealed to me this was not occurring. At
It's
least,
not working.
or at least it didn't seem to be working. I remember praying in bed at night, right? Maybe I'm 15 years old, and discovering that this is actually not bearing any fruit. Now, who knows what that actually means? Perhaps it did bear fruit, right, in mysterious ways. But in any case, I'm at the point in my life where, according to this developmental curve, a certain particular kind of religious experience is not available to me, and it's not even available to me as a secular person. It just doesn't seem to actually square with secular experience, with what it's like to wake up on any given day, with what it's like to actually comport yourself and to conduct yourself in the world. And that's just not my experience. It's the experience of many people living today. We're not living in medieval Europe. It's just not the case that we live in a God-saturated, enchanted world, as Max Weber would put it. So that's the second step. And then I carry on that way, thinking that there's a kind of irrelevance about the whole thing. It was almost a positive sense, a positivistic sense. Why even speak about these things whatsoever? There is the business of living to be involved in. So not for nothing, when I began philosophizing with people, I was very Greek, ancient Greek about it. We would talk about the nature of a good life. And that was really understandable and some pretty strict set of terms, right? These are things we can make sense of. These are goods that have to do with happiness in this life. That was more or less, in large respect, until I met other people, the alpha and omega, if you will, of the inquiries. And then here's the personal experience. I'll fast forward some. Well, I had a mystical experience around 2012 that I've written about a number of times. My wife and I had it, and it was the first time I meditated. And the first time I meditated, which and nothing really happened after 10 or 15 minutes. But then we went to Central Park, where we're living. We weren't living in Central Park, we're living in New York City. Just to make that clear.
Okay, noted.
We're squatting in Central Park. We passed the threshold of Central Park, and then there was just this amazing sense of non-judgmental uplift and joy. There was less self. There was less of a sense of a separate self. Maybe almost none, just a kind of luminous, beautiful, joyful, timeless opening. I could probably say more about that, but that's the first taste. And it suggests that my ordinary take on the nature of reality perhaps is not the final take. So that's the first genuine opening or crack at that point. And the second one, so that led me to actually start meditating. This is some good stuff.
Yeah, that happens every time. That's great.
Yeah, it doesn't. And meditation is not about having these wonderful experiences. That's called spiritual materialism for people who are familiar with that term. That's just another version of trying to acquire some kind of experience or material. The second important formative experience that opened me up to the possibility of the sacred is when my eldest sister unexpectedly died in 2014. That was a tragedy for our family, clearly. But the other thing that people don't often speak about in these situations, where it's about just merely the psychological, merely the process of grieving, is the metaphysical. And by metaphysical, I'm speaking philosophically here. I just mean there are questions about the nature of reality that can become open to you when you get burst asunder, when you're burst open. And that's what happened to me, very unexpectedly. I began to question. I began to take my philosophical training, my understanding of Socrates, and realize that I had gone far enough. There are things that I had shelved, I had put off to the side. And that tends to be what happens in our lives. We tend to shelve things or set them off to the side on the grounds that they're either unanswerable or uninteresting or irrelevant or whatever. And all those started coming back. And so that was the first time that I began to ask all these weird questions. I put them in. Does the body, when the body perishes, do I perish? It's a metaphysical question. If what if I don't? Maybe I do, but what if I don't? Um, is there more? Is there more to reality than what our ordinary experience and what science both describe? Maybe that's a genuine possibility. Lots of people, lots of mystics and such have said, yes, there is indeed. You don't even know what you're talking about. There's a lot going on up and around here.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's, and as I've gotten into it more, it hasn't been the case that I've somehow devalued our ordinary ways of speaking or ordinary experiences, but it has made me realize that there's a kind of abundance or fecundity um, available to us. And so that's at the metaphysical level. I was really opened up. So when you talk about tarot cards, I'm like, yeah, that's totally fine, man. I've heard I've done lots of things since then. It's not.
Yes.
I'm open to the possibility that there is something beyond the perceptible. Every time you close your eyes and meditate, you open yourself up to the possibility that there is something, dare I say, invisible that could be a part of that experience. And I'm not speaking here about invisible spirits or some such. I'm just using that in a very bland sense. Right? Anytime it's the case that you go through sensory deprivation, you close down your sense organs, you close your eyes, your hearing begins to unattend from sounds. You don't taste anything. You're not licking door handles. Seems people to be doing today.
Yeah.
When the sense organs begin to actually become very quiet, then there is, and when our conceptuality, when our thinking becomes quiet. So imagine that the body becomes quiet and the mind becomes quiet. But there's still awareness, and I won't take too long to describe this to viewers. If there's still awareness, what is it? And it's not awareness of a particular object, then there's a newfound openness to possibilities. I'm not even going through a lot here in Zen or non-duality. I'm just saying that my own experience is actually of being aware in the absence of the ordinary experience that we are so accustomed to when it comes to sense objects and when it comes to thoughts and feelings. What happens if somehow I'm still here in the absence of everything that I had before grabbed onto? So I can say a lot more, but the simple thing is that a lot of things that before had seemed too weird to be taken up now no longer seem to have that status for me.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I endorse everything. That's the key.
Yeah.
I'm not endorsing everything, but I'm willing to enter into conversation with it and with people of that sort.
Yeah. I find myself thinking of, the way that you described sort of the real life, like the existential opening, as you call it in the past, of like, it's not this or that, it's something else, maybe. And just like I really like that. I've had that resonates with me, and I find it to be a pretty useful. I don't know if it's useful or not, but I like that mindset, and I think that there is a lot that we can learn from that mindset in terms of, after we push, it's about first including the possibility that all these things are around us and potentially there, and then also asking like, and what else? What else is there? Because if these things are all here and possible, then like clearly I'm not going to be able to go through the whole catalog of things, and like identify them and name them and put a label on them. It's just too many things. And
I
so there are
can't always
probably
put a
things,
label on everything because they're not objects amenable
right?
to language. Not everything
Right.
is anyway. Not everything is a thing. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
so the what else
Yeah.
becomes crucial.
And why is there a source of things? So
Yeah,
I did also latch on to mythology, because this
yeah,
idea of the dark forest has really been like a visual, tangible thing for me to think about, like the void or chaos or um, emptiness or all these things. That's like there's an endless, inexhaustible source of stuff that makes no sense, or stuff that like is going to resist labels, or just by sheer number.
mhm,
And we're sort of like working our way into the dark forest and be like, okay, on the perimeter we can like put up some signs and label the forest, and so
mhm.
like, okay, this stuff is evil, this stuff is good, this stuff is like iffy, this stuff used to be good but it's now bad, um, and but then as you keep on going further, like those stop working, and you find a
Right.
new layer like of stuff that doesn't fit those categories at all and has a different shape entirely. And so I love it as like, Alan Watts calls it like the what does he call it, the irreducible element of irreducible rascality. Like, no,
Mm.
it's like no matter how much you like slice it and cut it up and put the parts in the right place, like
Yeah,
there's an element that doesn't fit in the box, or that got lost, the Lego piece or the puzzle piece that like, where to go,
yeah.
like the Gödel's theorem, or all these things where there's just like that seed of, oh yeah, this doesn't work.
Do you think it's
And
possible to go into the dark forest and and unencumber yourself of your layers of language and categories and labels?
yeah, 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 like
Is that
using that
is it
as a way
possible?
to like shed the
Yeah,
things one layer at a time, like, not too fast. It's sort of like eating the shadow, but you don't want to just like, you know gorge yourself on it, because you'll probably, die or something. But um it's always like this frontier. I mean, I'm terrified of death. That's one of the things that I've just always been afraid of. I'm sure we all are. But I had this very specific mental ritual I would do every single night as a kid,
mm,
which would be like peeling the layers of my illusion of life and like sort of immortality off, until I was just like terrified. Like, oh wait, it really is gonna end, and I really am gonna end, and it's really gonna. And I would just like burst into tears and like run to my parents, and like cry like night after night. I just would, every night I would just do this to myself, until at some point I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. But I need to use that as a tool to like, I don't want to like damage myself by like worrying about this too much, but I do think there's an infinite amount of motivation and gratitude and sort of um, curiosity that can be mined from that like dark forest, or that fear or that shadow, because suddenly when I do this, I'm like, oh my gosh, everything is important,
right,
everyone is important,
right.
everything I have to like cherish everything.
Mm,
And I have, and it's like the infinite fossil fuel, kind of thing, like it's not going to run out. So
mhm.
it's always there for me to tap into if I need energy. But it's in that very painful direction,
Mm. Why do you think it's painful though?
because I'm not ready to. One of my goals is to basically come to terms with death by the time I die, right?
I would say that's
And
any that's beautiful. I think that should be. If I had to make one universal claim, it would be I think all of us should come to terms with death before the body perishes.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it's painful because we have all of these useful attachments on our illusion that help us get our jobs done.
Yeah.
And so when we're like, oh well, if that's not useful, it's not real, then how am I getting my job done? Well, maybe the job is also one of those things, but then how am I going to pay for? And bringing it all the way back to coronavirus, this is sort of
Mm,
coronavirus is doing this
mm,
for us in a lot of ways, of like just remove all those things. um, not necessarily
Mm.
at the skill level that everyone is matched to, unfortunately. But yeah, it is painful.
I'm still not sure, but pardon, I'm not playing the role of the ignoramus here. That's someone who's totally ignorant. But what is it that's so painful about our confronting the fear of our own mortality?
um, how to articulate? I mean, I think it's so. I value existing, right? And I don't personally, and I also know that it's an illusion. So it's like this thing that is valuable, that um, is slowly being pulled. The thread is slowly being like unwoven from your sweater, um, and you can agree. I mean, so there are. I think grieving that process is not necessarily painful,
Hmm.
but it's also, it makes you a little, it wears you down a little bit, right? In terms of like, what the things I can do today, this is going to take 30% of my thing, of my spoons, um, to just contemplate this truth, um, and now the rest of my day has to like deal with less, I guess.
Hmm. I think that the fear of death is at the heart of philosophy and religion and spirituality in some fashion or another. One philosopher whose name I can't recall all of a sudden, I'm sure is related to Heidegger's claim about being toward death, just suggests that really religion begins with the idea of our own limitations, and most notably our limitation with respect to death, the fact that we're going to die. And so there are many religions that spring up, particularly during the first axial age, that are these pretty interesting, varied responses to the fear of death. One might say there's an afterlife and there's a soul in the afterlife. Another might say, a la Hindu terms, that you actually are the nature of reality. Uh, Buddhism says something different. There is no one really, ultimately, who can be afraid of death, because there is no self. So the ego is concerned with its own perishing. But if it turns out that you are not the ego, but what's called Buddha nature or Shunyata, the boundless, empty nature of reality, then surprise, there's no one there to be afraid of all this. And
Yeah.
or I can quote Plato. Well, I'm actually quoting Cicero, who once said of the Socrates who was being spoken of in Plato's Phaedo, to philosophize is to learn how to die. I'm sure many people have heard that in some form or another. And so
Yeah.
that, so that's what's really poignant in the proper sense about the coronavirus. It is creating the possibility for existential openings for people who are beginning to see that this is not just about preparedness, though it is certainly at a practical level about preparedness. And it's not just about concern and care, which are important ethical concepts here. It is about that, but it's also about the fact that we're starting to feel, perhaps without articulating it, that there's an existential anxiety, as Paul Tillich put it.
Mm-hmm.
This is one reason why you may have read some of my things about total work, which I won't talk about at great length here during our conversation. But the basic presumption is that if we transform ourselves into doers who are involved in endless doings with respect to working, then maybe it's the case we think we won't have to ever deal with our existential anxiety. And what happens when you bring everyone home and they can't work all the time, and they don't know what to do with themselves? And there's a sense of boredom or ennui or acedia, as Joseph Pieper called it. Acedia means it's agitated restlessness of spirit. I like to think of it a bit like a lion in a cage, lion biting the bit of the cage. What happens when you have that? man, this is the fear of death just revealing itself. It's flashing up.
Yeah, yeah. And like any um, sort of difficult experience, we're either gonna, I mean, there's two roads, or there's probably many roads. You know, half some of the roads are going to make sure that work becomes more important, right?
Mhm.
Find new, better work that's not going to be threatened. You know,
Right,
remote work, and
right, right.
um, um, and then some of it's, and you know, I think there are ways to use religion or fate or destiny or God's will, or these ways to um, also duct tape over the painful parts of it. You know, just like, okay, well, it's painful, but that's fake pain. You know, it's not the real pain.
Mhm.
I'm really interested in,
Yeah.
well, like, what if? I mean, that's why I think I still come back to it being painful, is because I think the pain is, and the impulse to um, uh, find a way to resolve it, I guess. That's that's I think the or like the mental habit that I'm interested in shaving down, right? The impulse to, I mean, not to become a, there's so many like landmines in this topic, but like,
Yeah.
you know, not to become an enjoyer of pain, but um, the impulse to avoid it when it's not really, it's not physical pain. I mean, it might be hunger, it might be coldness, it might be aloneness, it
Mm.
might be grief, all these things, but like those things aren't good or bad. They're not welcome. They're not convenient. And they're not necessarily conducive to life,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
they're not
Yeah.
good or bad. And so there is a chance for, you know, something else to like, but there's so many safeguards too. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to help us or not. That's how I felt
Yeah.
after like thinking about bias. It's like the more you learn about bias, the more biased you become.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily providing, just because logically it makes sense doesn't mean it will turn out to be good.
I thought you were getting, yeah, I think you're getting close to something really quite beautiful. And correct me if I misunderstood you here. So there's a desire to resolve the matter. And I thought you were suggesting that maybe if I set that off to the side, I'll be able to come back to the painfulness, the painful nature of the pain.
Yeah.
And then what creeps in is the some kind of avoidance strategy. So we usually have two ways that we commonly respond. And this is not a royal way, including myself in it as well. Uh, One is to try to solve it somehow. The other is to try to avoid it somehow. I have a wonderful Dharma friend who once told me what his understanding of his meditation practice was. And at first I was like, okay, that doesn't seem like much. And then I sat with it more. I thought, this is brilliant.
Mm.
He said his meditation is simply being with whatever arises. Okay, the listener might have heard that and not really let it soak in as I did initially. But once it soaks in, it's really astonishing to be with whatever it is that arises. So that also means, especially that I can be with non-judgmentally, welcomingly, openly, the arising of the painfulness associated with the fear of death. And that doesn't mean, and the being with is not angling in one direction or the other. It's not saying, okay, if I am with it, maybe that will resolve it. Right? There's no agenda. And it's
Right.
also not, I'm with it, but I'm not really with it. I'm dissociating myself from it in a certain way that it's really a certain avoidance.
Right.
So there's really quite some meditation people would call this the open space of awareness. There's a remarkable open space of awareness in which the pain is arising. It's arising to me, and there's no impulse whatsoever to do anything with it, which is, you could not to come back to conversation, but that's also, I think, the beauty of conversation, to allow things to arise in the conversation and not to squeeze or massage or push or pull.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would even say, like, not fixating on it, not denying it, like in that David Chapman sense of like being in the nebulous sort of
Yeah,
neither of those things. Um, but also, if you could still like get your feet, to have a conversation with it would be
yeah,
okay. I think that's where you can say, you know, I'm afraid of this, or I
yeah,
know I'm not ready for this, or and then listen to like sort of what echoes back. I think a little bit in terms of like what
yeah.
can I learn? Like how can I push a little bit further into this without you know shuttling it into one of the lanes? Um,
Right.
and that's dialogue. That's the that is reality. I think that's the conversational nature of reality that I think about a lot, which is when you can get to that point where like you know the tune is in your head, you're synced up, and then like find the edges and like allow yourself to have a shape, at the same time, and see if those shapes can change.
Right. And while you're listening to the pain, there's there's just a complete uh, there's just complete openness. So sometimes people will say in meditation that when a thought arises, it's okay to welcome the thought, to have tea. So you can welcome the
Mhm,
thought to have tea with you,
mhm,
which isn't quite. I mean, if it's painful, that might sound a little bit harder to do. But what's really strange about what we're describing is that in a certain respect, to put a paradox on it, it's the easiest thing and the hardest thing. It's the easiest thing because once we get the hang of it, this is very Taoist in nature. Of course, we can listen to whatever is arising. How loving and open and welcoming is that? That is so natural to us. It's the hardest thing though, because depending on whatever kind of theory you want to propose here, it seems as though this is precisely what we haven't been up to for quite some time. Therefore, it seems quite alien to us.
yeah, yeah. I've only done like silent meditation once for 10 days a long time ago, but I distinctly remember voices in my like head becoming a much more known thing.
Yeah,
And um, it's I think the voices are the part that um, make it so hard, because sometimes you are the voice and sometimes the voice is at you, or and so the voice like, well, you can't, I sort of like earlier in this conversation you're like, but I don't endorse it, right? I don't endorse all things. That's a voice saying like, oh, you're endorsing all things. Right? And you have to talk back to it.
mm,
And um, and we have these voices that are sometimes like been around for so long that they are very familiar with us, and they'll say pretty pointed things like, um, "You're wasting your time." Well, if we are in dialogue, if we're inviting this, why are we inviting death to tea when you could be going and being more productive? You could help someone pay their rent this month, or you can help someone who's grieving. Why are
yeah.
you being so selfish?
At that
These,
point, I think what's interesting is that um, uh, I like to ask where is that thought? Where is that thought coming from?
mhm,
Then there's a kind of sinking down into a layer of feeling, and it's probably fear. The
mhm,
fear is giving rise to the thought, and thought is giving rise to the action, the proposed action.
mhm,
So the difficult bit is that one no longer is able to give a stamp of approval on thoughts because they've gotten free passes for quite some time. Because they might be motivated by a deeper feeling. The deeper feeling might be just almost inarticulable. It's felt in the body. Basically, I'm scared or whatever.
mhm,
So that my friend would say, okay, well, is it possible to be with that? Right? Is it possible to feel with the felt sense or the feeling that's arising?
Yeah,
And,
you're
and,
basically
and
constantly hopping from thought to thought, like embodying it at the same time, like because it's talking to you, and then you become the talking voice, and then you are with it, and then another voice gets you, and then you're like, okay, I'll be that voice for a little bit. You're like, it's like, Keanu Reeves jumping on trains or something. I don't know.
I didn't see that coming.
That's exactly what meditation is, right there. It's like, yeah. I don't know if that's a perfect metaphor, but the shift from like the like the outside like the outside view of a thought to the inside view of a thought, and then the inside view of another sort of voice, or
Yeah.
and sort of a chain of things. Like there isn't a final voice necessarily, at least the whatever's the final thing isn't a voice, I think, but that's the only way we can talk to ourselves. So if we're yeah, we always eventually like, okay, well, I got to the last voice. The last voice is really cool. I'm the last voice in charge, and now I'm done. But that could be like, and that's why I became a monk. That's why I became a CEO, or whatever it is that eventually someone gets crowned as the chief voice in your head, and they get the protector power. It's getting really weird, but this is sort of how I think about it. I don't say it out loud very often.
I mean, the other possibility is that there isn't a crowning of any of those voices.
Right.
I mean, that's more or less the Buddhist insight. That is, they're all voices arising, and as what's his name? Robert Wright. Looking at the book over here. Robert Wright put it in his book "Why Buddhism is True," the book that was quite popular for secular-minded people, is that there is no CEO self. It's at least a possibility. I mean, so long as we're involved in considering possibilities from the standpoint of openness, then it should also be the case that there may be no final voice that ever gets crowned king. They're all just phenomena arising. But that would be scary for some people listening to this, to be sure, because it seems rather unanchored, so to speak. But it's also, if you flip it around, it's also quite liberating, because you don't have to, if it's true, it may not be true, but if it's true, you don't have to pretend that this one voice is precisely who I am. And the other ones, we're getting back to shadows, perhaps, even given that you had a reference to it, you're not going back and saying, well, that's not me, and that's not me, and that can't be me, and that's certainly not so.
Yeah.
But that also applies to, for example, the painfulness of the fear of death. If that's located in a voice or in a feeling, and we come to open ourselves up to the possibility that we're not quite that voice and not that feeling, but it doesn't mean that we're disassociated from it either, then there's also this new possibility. The new possibility is that the fear can arise without it being a bull in a china shop. It doesn't take hold in the same way it once did.
Yeah. I think that's an aspiration I have. And I think I'm on board with this idea that there is you don't have to crown someone. I've just found myself in an attempt to avoid that, not avoid, but like to remain fluid in the voices, is that there's always somebody that settles with it, and that voice is like, I'm the voice that isn't a voice, and
Right. Right.
and then you're like, oh crap, you're wearing a crown. What's going on over here?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think even if you want, this is where development comes in, I guess, is like you can see a possible place to be. I don't know. It's less like not um, doesn't get stuck, but it's still a long way to go to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me at least. Yeah.
Well, I think for many of us, I also came to this to precisely starting this channel because I've been grappling with the fear of death. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it's almost like a logical presupposition. It's not as though at any time of the day I've been gripped in the way that it seems you have when you're younger by this. But it's more like an obviousness. If I am such as to be perishable, okay, and if everything I care about is subject to change, subject to impermanence, and therefore if everything I care about shall perish, and if I shall perish, and if I have no idea about there being anything else, then how can I not be afraid? You see what I mean? This is why my joke, which is a little bit of a dark joke, is that everyone's afraid of everyone who hasn't come to some very deep realization. And I'm making that a very loose statement here. Has to be afraid of death. And they're just and then there just have to be various ways of more or less saying, no, I'm not. No, I'm not, because I'm this, or because I'm that, or because I'm involved in this other thing. And I've heard people often that way. I think this is why this is an existential opening could also be said to arise whenever one realizes that one actually is afraid of death. That's one way of defining it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to know that you're afraid of something if you refuse to think about it too.
Or feel anything in reference to it.
Yeah. 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 I mean, if we define it as as you just did, that whatever that's not how most people would define death necessarily, but that is a thing to be just afraid of, in the sense, not in the, doesn't have to be that's a bad guy, that's a bad part of the universe that's causing me to go through this, but just in the scary sense of, my hunch is just like, when I'm thinking about how do I come to terms with death before I die, is like, I have to be able to empathize with dirt and like be cool being dirt. Because that's dirt's pretty cool. I went on this long
what is I like that. What does that mean?
like,
what does that mean? I have to be able to empathize with dirt.
I have to be able to look at dirt and be like, I'm going to be you, and it's going to be cool. Dirt might have consciousness. It might have something, but it's less than what I'm exhibiting. Whatever it is, it's a very different experience. And it might not have consciousness. I sort of like the panpsychic sort of train of thought, but it might just be because it's something that sort of solves that problem for me. But even dead dirt, dirt on Mars, instead of just our dirt, is full of life, and so it's a little easier. But dirt on an asteroid, or dust in space, these are inert but material, energetic forms that we came from and will go back to, and that's who I need to empathize with. And I can almost get there sometimes. I don't know. It might just be a poetic sort of empathy, but there's definitely work there that I feel like I can do, or at least sort of, I don't know, relating, or a dialogue I can participate in.
If it's possible to speak about it, how have you almost gotten there sometimes?
How? I mean, I don't know. I think it's meditation with, whatever the brain proposes as, like, empathize with the dog, empathize with the plant, empathize. But it's proposing these things because they're easier ones. And so, like, try to go to the furthest place, which is the hardest to empathize with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what do I have in common? What is it like to be that? What is it like to be me? How different is it? Um, and just let that sink in, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, that's really good. I could imagine that maybe it may not just be the brain deflecting. It could actually be a ladder. Can I empathize with another human being? Okay, let me somehow feelingly, very intimately do that. And I don't know how to put that into words, but
Yeah.
right. Okay, so I empathize with another person, and then I move up to another sentient being, which is closer, I guess, maybe of a dog. And so you start finding ways of empathizing. What is it like to be that dog? What would it be like if I were that dog? There was one man a little while ago who actually was wearing some kind of goat outfit, and this is in Britain somewhere, and he had some kind of bioskeleton set up in order to participate in goating, right? What it's the quality
Wow.
of goat, so far as I know. So that's it. That's pushing it that's pushing it very far. I was thinking about using the feeling imagination to do so, but and then
That's
we might,
awesome.
yeah, and then so you can imagine doing all sort of sentient things, and then plants. What is it really like? My wife loves talking to plants, and
Me too.
yeah, and I know other people do, and I know people who would even go pretty far to say that they're communicating with plants, and they're not any communications. A quote, there's some kind of correspondence between the plant
Yeah.
and the person. Yeah, and so I'm more than open to that possibility. I think it happens. Okay, so we can communicate with plants, and you have to kind of move down to a point at which something that's so unlike us, like a fish is a hard one, but you go down to something like dirt and
Coronavirus.
coronavirus. Yeah. Well, I'm with you there. I'm much more sympathetic to that reply than to our warlike metaphors, which you probably saw on Twitter. I'm really quite concerned with our use of war metaphors in modernity to try to understand how we can defeat something. Um, that really comes back to the conversation we've been having today about various strategies by which we can either try to avoid or solve or resolve things. It's unfortunate. Even if it actually quote unquote works, it hasn't really gotten to the root of our existential predicament in the way that this conversation is trying to do. So the dirt,
Yeah.
actually imagine what it's like to be dirt and to feel what it's like to be dirt. I guess to smell the dirt, to feel the dirt, to feel like the dirt.
Yeah. And as you go down this chain, I think, or sideways along this chain, or whatever it is,
Yeah.
um, you do, one of the things that I've noticed is that, like, your sense of time and space and senses and things that are slowly sort of stretched a little bit, like,
Right.
I mean, being a tree is probably like a much slower sort of thing. Being dirt is a much, I would also say, like, a much slower thing. And maybe it's,
Mm-hmm.
uh, there isn't a single thought, but it's just, you know, as you were talking about peeling away the senses, and um,
Mm-hmm.
that's dirt.
Yeah. I like this. So all these meditations I've been doing is basically just I'm learning what it's like to be dirt. I'll tell my Zen teacher that.
Yeah, yeah. There was a great quote where this is what started my whole dirt thing, which was, dirt. No, wait, living things. What was it? How'd it go? Dirt. Being dirt is what living things do in between being alive, or something like that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of like, you know, it's a stage of our life. It's part. If you wanted to do the full circle of life,
Sure.
we don't become alive when we're born. Like, we're living cells all the way back to dirt.
Mm-hmm.
um, and we become, but then like between lives, I guess, our cells decompose and our cells recompose, um, and not into different things. And but there isn't, like, that's part of, there isn't a state, a point where you can be like, okay, well, now you're dirt and now you're a living thing,
Right.
and now you're air and a living thing. It's all like mixed together. um,
I like this. This is a little different from reincarnation stories that I'm familiar with, but no
yes.
less valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to make before I signed my book deal, an editor had written to me, and I hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but um, she's like, "Do you want to write a book?" I was like, "Yes, I do." And like, "Do you want to write about cognitive biases?" Like, no.
No, I
Like,
don't.
what do you want? What do you want to write a book about? Like, I want to write a book about. I want to write a children's book for systems thinking, and it was about this dirt life cycle, and in a comic book form, sort of thing. And she's like, that sounds really interesting, but I'm not the right editor for you.
It's a test of something. I'm not sure of what, but
Yeah, but yeah, it is. I think there's something. Um, I love. I've noticed that all sort of cycles. A cycle is such an interesting thing in itself. Like one of the other mythologies that um, come up a lot is the Ouroboros. Like, the snake eating its tail.
mm,
It's sort of like this, like taking something infinite and creating a closed loop, and
yeah,
by doing that, slicing infinity into pieces. And you get things like the calendar year, and
mm,
things like the musical scale and the color wheel, and all these
yeah,
things that like take infinite spectrums and like chunk them up. And I sort of think of the Ouroboros as the knife that cuts infinity. And all of these cycles, like carbon cycle, water cycle, phosphorus cycle, air cycle,
mhm,
um, they are a spectrum, right? It's an infinite spectrum, that we chop up into these cycles. And then at the top of every cycle is the living part, the good part, the part that's like the part that we can use.
mm,
Um, and we take the rest of the cycle and just like hide it, right? And so that's the boring part. That's where like water goes into the ocean for 3,000 years before it comes back into
right,
our ecosystem.
right,
Or these carbon molecules go underground for millions of years before they come back up. Like
mm,
boring, slow, useless, uneventful, not dramatic. And that's part of why I like them so much, because that's the one way to like push back your voice of productivity and I don't know, essential natureness, or like I like saying like, no, this is the whole thing is part of the same thing. We got to pay attention to all of it
right,
in order to understand it. And not only that, but we have to stretch it out so it's not a loop and it's just a wave or something.
mhm,
Um, and again, like, I guess these are all just like mental tricks I've developed to like dialogue with my my voices that tell me to be more productive. Yeah.
or yeah, maybe I don't know, but or what you were just talking about is it's this really beautiful way of trying to think about the fact that death only comes to really grip us when it's confined in a certain way. When it's opened up in various ways, whether it be through the kinds of processes you were just describing, or whether it be through reincarnation, or whether it be through I invite the Vedanta, which suggests that there is just eternity and it gets instantiated in these concrete forms, but we really are eternity. These are all ways of trying to um, decompress. And it's that decompression or expansion that is the loosening of the grip.
Hmm.
So really quite, however it goes, given given the mythology, you might say, on hand, it really does need to decompress. If you remain in a cramped room with the doors closed and the blinds down, listening to REM music, you're going to be in trouble. But once you open up the door, open up the windows and the shades, walk outside and begin to expand consciousness in some fashion, such that there's no longer just a little room, no longer just a little life, but something to which it is a part, to which it belongs, from which it comes. You can have the beginning. You have the beginning of mythology or cosmology.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe that is like an analog to the opening, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Is it Carl Sagan or who said like in order to bake an apple pie first you have to invent the universe? Or
right. This is true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you can't. Yeah, you can't just take ingredients. I mean, when you take an ingredient list, a recipe, you're assuming that the rest of the universe is there to help you. If you only had the ingredients, it wouldn't work.
Right. So I'm curious, as we're coming to the end of our beautiful conversation today, I wonder if we can't jam a little bit as we think about how this particular kind of conversation could be not a model, but just an example of what it's like to think and feel and understand during a time when things are tumultuous and scary. I don't know if you have any ideas about that.
I mean, I think it's encouraging that they can happen, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I barely know you. We're talking over Zoom.
Yeah.
And it's possible. It's possible to have these conversations. That's amazing. I think, speaking of the universe, part of our universe is that we have all these tools out there that enable communication and conversation, dialogue that we may have been using for completely different purposes, but we can exact them in the Vervaeke sense of the word of like use it for a different purpose, and bring back some of the humanity and bring back some of the like wandering, non-productive but honest conversations between people.
Yeah, it's been a very honest conversation between me and you. I like what one of my friends, Paul Miller, said in an email. Actually, wrote an email he sent to me. He's someone who's involved in these future work discussions and remote work and such. And he was just telling me that, in a brief sentence, that things are starting to get the bullshit. I think he said the bullshit isn't there right now, as it had been for many years. And it was just, that was the part that was really refreshing for him. And so in my lingo, I'd say that some people are starting to get real. And that's just very, 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 very nice. What am I trying to say? It's more than very, very nice. It's
miraculous in a way.
That's a better word. Yeah, it's miraculous. Yeah, beautifully put. It's miraculous. Yeah, it's like if I may speak poetically, it's like an act of grace. The nearly impossible reveals itself as an actuality, not just as a possibility. The nearly impossible actually manifests itself in being real with one another. It's not just consultants sitting around or facilitators sitting around talking about being vulnerable and in some kind of circle. Maybe that does happen, but in my experience, a lot of those things feel a little bit forced, a little unctuous, kind of a little oily. It's really nice actually just to be real. Miraculous. It's miraculous. More than nice. It's miraculous to be able to be real.
Yeah. I like how you said like the near impossible, because I was watching a video about someone who's a health systems worker describing coronavirus, and like her life's work is like developing health systems. And it was before any of the like lockdowns started happening in the United States. And she's like, lockdowns aren't going to solve the problem because lockdowns are impossible, right? Lockdowns, the kind of lockdown we need to do is just not on the table. And it's interesting because that's what we're doing in California, at least,
Yeah.
and hopefully other places soon. But when you're, when I can tell, like as a sort of expert in the field, sort of working on the periphery of society, trying to just like get education out. You never think that you could pull the lever of like shut everything down,
Right.
and then, but somebody can, in certain circumstances that arise, the timing works out, and we can do things that seemed impossible, and then they happen, and we're like, oh, well, that's the answer. Why didn't they just say that before?
Why didn't they say it before? A catalyst rupture everything we use to make sense of things.
Yeah, like we're looking for solutions in a much smaller sort of spotlight, and I think
That's
a
cool.
lot of our solutions are at the the scale of the forest almost, not at the scale of this chainsaw. um,
Right. It now occurs to me that I could define existential opening as follows: an existential opening occurs whenever the nearly impossible is actual.
yeah, more obvious, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this conversation today. It was really, really quite beautiful and in its own way miraculous. Thank
awesome.
you for it.
I enjoyed it immensely. So yeah, thank you for inviting me on.